This man is Salvador Allende, Chile's first socialist president, holding his baby granddaughter in 1971. Just 2 years later, Allende lost his life during a CIA-backed military coup that led to a brutal dictatorship. 50 years later, the baby in that photo became Chile's defense minister, in charge of the military that once overthrew her grandfather. She's part of the first leftist government since that coup, as Chile gets ready to write a new constitution that would finally do away with the dictatorship's legacy. The new government is led by this guy, Gabriel Boric, a leader in Chile's decade-long student movement. This is the story of how they won, and what the US can learn from it.
Que si Chile fue la cuna del neoliberalismo, también será su tumba, compañeros y compañeras.
This story starts, like many others in Latin America, with a US-backed coup. On September 11, 1973, President Salvador Allende's democratically elected government was overthrown by Chile's military, with the backing of the Nixon administration. That coup kicked off General Augusto Pinochet's brutal 17-year dictatorship.
Que en Chile existió el terrorismo de Estado, donde existió la desaparición forzada, existieron las torturas, las ejecuciones y la violación sistemática de cientos de chilenos durante 17 años.
Chile's military killed, tortured, and imprisoned as many as 40,000 people. More than 1,200 people, mostly political dissidents, were disappeared by the military during Pinochet's rule. Once in power, a team of American-trained economic advisors worked with Pinochet to use Chile as a lab to test their economic theories. The dictatorship decreased government spending, deregulated business, and privatized essential industries like education, healthcare, even water. The reason why that sounds familiar is because in the decades that followed, this economic model, known as neoliberalism, became the ideological consensus in the United States and many other countries. In 1980, Pinochet ensured neoliberalism was cemented in Chile by orchestrating a rigged vote that made it part of a new constitution. You see, the old constitution from 1925 actually had commitments to provide for the social welfare of all citizens. Pinochet's version got rid of those and instead encouraged privatization, which put government services up for sale.
In terms of health, education, housing, pensions, it gave a lot of power to the market.
After the first few years of neoliberalism, the country's GDP skyrocketed, growing an average of 7% per year from 1985 to 1997. Some called this the Chilean miracle, but anyone who looked deeper would see that growth mostly went to the top tier of Chilean society. In fact, today, Chile's richest 1% owns half of the nation's wealth. Meanwhile, more than half the country's households are considered economically vulnerable. I bet that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Now, why did the dictatorship need a new constitution to lock in its economic system in the first place? Well, the Pinochet regime needed to improve its international reputation, which was tarnished after years of brutalizing political dissidents. The dictatorship thought it could legitimize itself by appearing open to some elements of democracy. So the new constitution also included a promise to let Chileans vote for or against Pinochet's dictatorship. And on the off chance that the dictatorship lost that vote, the constitution also included roadblocks to stop future governments. For example, it created a National Security Council, made up mostly of military leaders, with the power to effectively override elected officials in the name of national security. One of the Constitution's chief architects said these provisions were meant to, quote, ensure that if adversaries come to govern, they are constrained. And that is exactly what happened. When pro-democracy groups were able to pressure Pinochet into finally holding a fair referendum, he lost.
Vote no.
But thanks to the Constitution, he held on to a lot of power.
Because you have to consider that when we have the referendum in 1988 to end the dictatorship, in fact, Pinochet not only was still in charge of the army, but then became one of his senators. So it wasn't really a fully democratic context to make the changes that were needed.
By the 1990s, Chile's voters were able to vote center-left governments into office, but the constitution stopped them from challenging the country's economic system. Like in other parts of the world, that challenge would be taken up by student movements. So in 2006, high school students went on a strike against the country's unequal education system. Under Pinochet, Chile's education system was partially privatized and increasingly unaffordable for many families, sort of like the charter system that's decimated public schools in the US. The movement became known as the Penguin Revolution because of the protesters' black and white school uniforms.
Se convoca paro nacional para el día de mañana en todo el país. Esperamos que se siga apoyando el movimiento ya que se considera que las demandas son justas.
More than 1 million students from both public and private schools participated in the strikes. One poll showed that 87% of the public supported the strikes, showing just how widespread discontent was within Chilean society. And the movement was successful. Kind of. Some reforms were introduced, but many students felt they didn't go far enough. They wanted the entire neoliberal education system changed. So in 2011, that same generation, now in college, organized an even bigger student movement, this time demanding free public university tuition. And this was when now President Boric became a movement leader.
Le estamos dando de nuevo una muestra clara a este gobierno que el movimiento estudiantil, después de un año, sigue en pie, no se cansa, seguimos en la lucha, cabros.
The demonstrations were often compared to other movements happening around the world at the same time, like the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, and the Indignados movement in Spain.
2011 was so massive and so radical at the same time that we actually felt that we could improve our lives and we could change the system.
In 2013, Boric and other movement leaders won seats in Chile's Congress. But like the Squad in the US, these upstarts weren't exactly running the show.
They became political representatives of the movement later, but that also, you can imagine, it also makes a lot of people suspicious because when people who are social leaders become politicians, some people don't really believe that that's where change can come from.
Instead, the same centrist coalitions that had governed Chile since the 90s continued to take turns running the country. But then, in 2019, the government raised prices on public transit, and Chile exploded. Once again, it was students who led the way. Protesters targeted not just the fare hike and the education policy, but the whole neoliberal system and its impact on healthcare, rent, utilities, pensions.
In the past decades, you would see social movements organizing and protesting against specific neoliberal policies in housing, in pension system, in healthcare education, against patriarchal violence, against women and LGBT community. But then in 2019, the movement as a whole realized that we needed not partial change, but more structural change. And then the idea of having a new constitution through a constituent assembly sort of coalesced all the different movements and all the different demands.
Boric, who had been organizing in favor of a new constitution since he entered Congress, used his power to strike a deal with center-right President Sebastián Piñera for a constitutional referendum. Unlike the Pinochet constitution, which was written only by the dictatorship, this new one would be written at a democratically elected constitutional convention, with voters approving the process at each step. 17 of the convention's 155 seats were reserved for indigenous communities, and the convention was evenly split between men and women, a world first. The convention now began the long process of drafting a new constitution. Meanwhile, Piñera's presidency was coming to an end, and supporters of the new constitution had to make sure they had an ally in Chile's highest office.
Having a government that supports the process and wants people to be fully informed is very, very important for the legitimacy of the process too.
Boric was chosen to lead the left-wing Apruebo Dignidad coalition.
It represented leadership that came from student movement in 2011, a political project that kind of grew over the last 10 years, like from people that were in uni, that build their own political parties.
His main opponent was Jose Antonio Cast, who has family ties to the Pinochet regime. Also, his dad was literally a member of the Nazi party.
He reclaims the legacy of Pinochet for Chile.
The election's first round features several candidates across the political spectrum. In that round, Boric actually came in second place, with Kast in first.
That fear of having a new Pinochetista in power was a key factor. So that's one reason why a lot of people who didn't go to vote for Boric in the first round went to vote for him in the second round.
But in the second round runoff election, Boric pulled off a resounding victory, winning nearly 56% of the vote, the largest majority in Chile's history.
Nuestro proyecto significa avanzar en más democracia. Y por supuesto, como ya lo hemos dicho acá, como lo hemos peleado y trabajado juntos con ustedes que están hoy día en las calles, defender y cuidar el proceso constituyente.
After his win, Boric announced the members of his cabinet. Not only would it include Maya Fernandez, Salvador Allende's granddaughter, but it would also be majority women, a first in the Americas. Cabinet members also included fellow student leader turned politician Camila Vallejo, showing just how far the movement had come. When Boric visited the presidential palace, he took this photo with a bust of President Allende and tweeted a promise to continue building on his dreams of a better Chile. But with the Constitutional Convention still underway and Chile's economy still recovering from the pandemic, those dreams face many challenges ahead.
The biggest challenge of Boric's government is keeping this moment of change, of structural change in Chile, open. He has the historical opportunity of not being another neoliberal government, but the first president of a new, not completely new society, but at least the beginning of a new society.